experience here in Nairobi. From spotting animals in the wild to tasting Kenyan coffee and embracing Maasai culture. There's still so much to explore, but now, time for my next adventure.
Travel along Uzbekistan's Silk Road with us and discover how ancient East-West exchanges shaped the country's modern-day culture, ideas and flavors. Watch Silk Road Adventures on Euronews and Euronews.com.
Euronews. European weather.
Good evening and welcome to this special report, Brexit 10 years on. I'm Mared Gwyn, broadcasting live from the European Parliament in Brussels. On this week, 10 years ago, the UK took a decision that would change its course. After a campaign that was at times bitter and divisive, 52% of voters chose to leave the European Union. The choice left Europe reeling and determined not to set a precedent that would lead to other nations following the same path. After years of painfully fraught negotiations between Brussels and London, an agreement was reached in late 2020 and refined 3 years later. Over the past decade, political instability has plagued the UK. And today, Brexit is back at the centre of the political debate as another Prime Minister, the 7th in 10 years, waits in the wings. Andy Burnham is in pole position to become the next Prime Minister and inherits the work of resetting post-Brexit ties with the EU. Stay with us for the next 45 minutes because we'll bring you interviews with Michel Barnier, the EU's former chief Brexit negotiator, Leo Varadkar, the former Irish Prime Minister, and Brexit activist Gina Miller. We'll also be hearing from the UK's Minister for EU Relations, Nick Thomas-Symonds. And joining me in the studio tonight are MEPs Martin Sturdevan and Cynthia Niebuhr. Thank you so much for your company. We'll be hearing plenty from you throughout the night. But first tonight, let's start with our Europe editor, Maria Tadeo, who's here with us in the studio. Good evening, Maria.
Great
Good to see you. Listen, I know that you were covering Brexit back 10 years ago. You've covered the ensuing negotiations. Maybe let's start by, you can maybe recall where you were 10 years ago and that moment.
And I think, Mared, look, it was a real shock at the time. And of course, we can talk about the many shocks that came after when you look at the pandemic, obviously the war in Ukraine, and now the very global instability that we see certainly under the presidency of Donald Trump. But at the time, this was a shock, complete and utter shock. And just to give you a sort of anecdote, at the time, I was a reporter, and they sent me out on this assignment, and I had to report both from Gibraltar, obviously, that's a kingdom, well, a territory, belonging to the United Kingdom, physically located in Spain, and then I had to tour the Spanish coast, which is, the Brits, well, they just love it. And during those days, just right before the vote, I went around and I asked the many Brits that we encountered, how do you feel about this? What sense do you get? And all of them said, I will vote to remain. It's better to stay in the European Union because the rest would be an unknown, and we're not in the mainland UK. There's too much risk and too much uncertainty. And they would all say, we are voting at this point, certainly in Gibraltar, to stay. Now, I'm a reporter, obviously I have to file a story, and I sent a story right before I went to bed thinking, okay, this is going to be tight, but nonetheless, they will probably remain. And I sent my headline, and it said something like, relieving the Costa. Then I get a call from my editor at 7 a.m. in the morning who told me, I hope you did your job and your due diligence. You need to call all of these people again and get their reaction, and I did. And at the time, and this really stayed with me very vividly, 7:30 in the morning, I picked up the phone. They were already awake because they had stayed up all night watching the vote, and there was real panic that morning, saying, what's going to happen to us? Are we leaving the European Union? What does this mean for my pension? What does this mean for my livelihood? Indeed. So it was certainly a real shock, and certainly for the European Union. We talk about countries that want to join, but up until that moment, we have never seen the opposite process.
And 10 years later, the world has shifted quite radically. Where is the European Union now, 10 years on?
Look, I think fundamentally it has shifted because we've seen the war in Ukraine, the presidency of Donald Trump that is ushering in a lot of changes. Certainly, funnily enough, when it comes to defense and security, we now see that the UK and the European Union understand continental security needs to be handled together and much closer. So there's ways in which the two can come together. Obviously, with time, there's something that you need to see and that you see in the numbers. When it comes to the United Kingdom, certainly it took a hit in the economy. When you look at many projections, they say the economy has been shrinking about 6 to 8% because of lost access, really direct access to the single market. And that is certainly a moneymaker. The idea that they would cut back regulation and that would lead to sort of Singapore, that the UK would become and would have the flexibility of regulation to grow the economy, that has not fully manifested. When you look at migration numbers, net migration is down from Europeans, but of course 10 years on there's a question of, do we not need this labor? And when it comes to the EU, I think we've seen a process of a reset that is becoming very difficult because some of the red lines have continued. And then there's a question of now really in the zeitgeist of the United Kingdom, is there a way to return? Is there a prime minister who's going to put that firmly on the table and campaign that, looking also to a general election at some point, to say we go back? And that was a question that I put to Michel Barnier. We were in Paris this morning. We spoke to him. Obviously, he negotiated those details, and he told me both have changed dramatically, the EU and the United Kingdom. There is a way back, but it must be decided first by London. Let's take a look.
10 years after, the Brexit remains, for both sides, a lose-lose game. So we have to draw the lessons about the reason of the Brexit, why 52% of the British people vote against Trump. Brussels was presented by everybody, the nationalist sides, Farage, Johnson, as a kind of scapegoat. Everybody knows that is not the case. A part of the answers, a part of the solutions are in Brussels, but just a part. A large part of the other answers are in London or in the regions. But nevertheless, the point is that the Brexit is done. For us, is on the book. And now we have to work in the best way as possible.
And when I listen to your words, the impression that I get is that you do believe this process is over. The conversation of returning to the EU, is that something that you'd say it's a fantasy?
No, I don't think so. I think the Brexit decided by a sovereign vote 10 years ago is done. But the future is open and the door is open.
The door is open?
Yes, the door is open. And the UK government, the UK authorities, the UK the public parties knows clearly what are the conditions.
And what are the conditions? Because it seems to me in the UK, those who have tried to implement Brexit, they hit a wall with the economy because it doesn't really work. And those who try to reset, they struggle to explain how it would work.
You can have the cake and eat it. You cannot dance in two weddings in the same time. So the conditions are very clear. If you want to join the single market, being outside of the union, look at the Norway case. Norway is inside the single market, their choice, a right choice in my view, for the mutual benefit, but they didn't want to be inside the union, the European Union. So it's perfectly possible.
And is this conversation happening, would you argue, based on your political instinct, as a result of Brexit did not really deliver what it promised? Or is it also the product of Donald Trump, which now means the Europeans have realized they got to come together?
But we have to explain that the UK left 10 years ago in not the same today. We have provoked and created a lot of change, in my view, in a good sense, good direction, because of the COVID crisis, because of the problem created by the uncontrolled migration, because of the financial crisis too, 15 years ago, and also because of the incredible war, the aggression of the Russia against Ukraine. Obviously, the fact that the U.S. president is so aggressive against us is an element, a very important element for us to be sure that we need to do for ourselves what nobody will come to do at our place.
But there is a reality after Brexit. The idea of exit in the European Union no longer became as popular. We don't hear in France the idea of Brexit. In Italy, the Italexit sort of basically died out. The populism within the EU talks about changing from within, not leaving.
But the populists are sometimes clever, and they know that what happened in the world around us, with Trump, with the Chinese aggressivity for trade and the aggression of Russia, give the proof to everybody that we need to be together. But I don't think that the populists in France, the nationalists from the far right and the far left, have changed their mind. Mrs. Le Pen, when the day of the Brexit, the night of the Brexit, said, "Congratulations to the British people. They had the courage to escape from the European servitude." The right words of Mrs. Le Pen. And I never listened Mrs. Le Pen or Mr. Barnier saying that they were wrong. So I don't think they changed their mind. These people from the far right and even the far left want to destroy the EU. Huh?
They want to destroy the EU.
They are nationalists. They are nationalists.
That was the EU's former chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier. Let's bring in our two MEPs, Martin Shona and Cynthia Ni Vercout. Martin, let me bring you in first because you were obviously on the Brexit steering committee. You oversaw, scrutinised the whole withdrawal process. What do you make of the fact Michel Barnier now saying the door could be open now for the UK to rejoin?
First of all, it's good to hear from Michel again. We spent a lot of time in many meetings and discussed the consequences of the referendum. What I want to say is that, of course, Michel is right. The door should be open. The door is open. But therefore, the British need to make up their mind. What we can see now is that the repercussions for Great Britain, for the United Kingdom, were enormously, both economically and socially, but also when it comes to political questions. The political instability in the United Kingdom has reached, I don't know, unknown peaks. And this is something that really is a lesson learned for all the other Europeans and also us, that we have to be very vigilant when it comes to right-wing populism, and Michel was touching upon that question. It has been the prototype of a right-wing campaign that led to a disastrous result for the United Kingdom, and this is something that we all have learned from the situation.
Yet some would say that the Labour Party has been very careful not to alienate those people who voted for those, let's say, populist far-right parties during the Brexit campaign. Let's bring you, Cynthia, some statistics before I come to you, because recent polling does suggest that, in fact, if young Britons who were not old enough to vote at the time in 2016 could vote today, that as many as 70% of them would vote to rejoin the EU, and as many as 57% of the wider British population thinking that the UK was wrong to vote leave. Cynthia, the question, is there political courage, do you think, in the UK to recognise this shift in public opinion and to at least debate the possibility of rejoining?
Yeah, I think there's political space. I can't answer the question about courage because we've got an incumbent Prime Minister. We're in the not knowing zone, so we don't really know what and how the direction is going to take us. But I do think that there is political space there now, and of course politicians, we don't really trade in money, we trade in votes. So I think there will be votes there, as if you've just outlined with those statistics, particularly the change in demographics and the younger people, and as you say, older people too. Yes, I think there's political space there to really consider it, and that's part of the success of Andy Burnham and the by-election, even though he didn't campaign on the Brexit and let's rejoin, let's get rid of Brexit, let's go back in again. He was very careful not to campaign on that in the by-election, in the local by-election. But it's extremely important to remember that the demographics, because you're quoting figures, the demographics at the time, 10 years ago, there was a much higher percentage of the population were over the 55, over the 60 mark. And there was a huge campaign of misinformation and disinformation. And remember that net migration was running at 300,000 a year going into Britain. And when some of those factors and more were conflated, there was also a massive advertising campaign, you probably remember it at the time, for the Brexit vote, which was £350 million per week is leaving Britain, and we're funding Europe. But of course that was not the net figure in terms of the return figure that was coming from Europe. So I just want to say thanks to Michel Barnier, a good friend to Ireland, but indeed to the European Union as well, because we heard about the shocks that your editor spoke about in terms of the journalistic shocks, and I can remember just as a citizen back then, the shock that I felt and the shock that Ireland felt. But of course for Europe, they were losing a huge net contributor, a massive market.
Okay, let me bring in you again, Martin, because what does the EU need to do here then, in terms of preparing? We know that, there's a big focus on enlargement, but this has really never happened before, the prospect of a member who's left rejoining. Should it be preparing for that possibility?
Not yet, and not actively. I think really the ball is in the field of the United Kingdom now, and of the Britons, and there will be a change of government there.
And do you know anything about Andy Burnham and his positions?
I don't know too much about Andy Burnham particularly, but I think that Labour had a huge problem back in the day, 10 years ago. They were not really campaigning to remain, but they were also not really campaigning to leave. And that opened the door for both the Conservative, the Tories, and the extreme right, who was advocating massively to leave, and that then eventually led to this, I would call, political catastrophe. And I remember very well where I was that night, because I was, for professional reasons, in Athens. I checked the news before I went to bed, and then I thought, well, everything seems to be fine so far. And then I woke up the next morning and the picture had been completely changed. So there was then a majority in favor of leaving the European Union. And that has sent shockwaves even to Athens. And I could feel that. That was like a political earthquake.
Yeah. But I think, if I may,
just one point, because it was mainly the young people who voted in favor of remaining. And that now, obviously, and you mentioned that in your remarks, that now has changed, because there are more people also seeing the real social and political consequences and also economic consequences. And all the polls now say that there is at least a neck-to-neck or a tie, but sometimes the polls even indicate that there is a majority in rejoining the European Union again. And this is something positive, I think.
Cynthia, sorry, your response.
Yes, no, I was just going to say that Europe did a great job, body of work, you included, and all of the negotiators, to try and ensure that we wouldn't see more of the France exit, or not suggesting Germany would, or Italy, or whatever, your home country. But we didn't want to see this becoming a trend. But what has happened for Europe as a result, if we leave aside the trade difficulties and leaving aside Ireland, because it's too much an individual case, and we didn't want a hard border, we could never go back on the Good Friday Agreement. But leaving that aside, what has been the implication for Europe is that the far right have grown as well, and that has come to fruition in the current mandate, which is the only mandate that I've sat in. You've more experience, but the complexity and the complexion of the Parliament is very much skewed towards the far right now.
Thank you for that, both of you. But we are now, in fact, crossing over to Dublin. We did touch on the Irish question there. And we can bring in our correspondent, Shona Murray. Shona, great to see you. And you will be a very familiar face to Euronews viewers in the UK, in Ireland, across Europe, as you were spending all your time back then covering every aspect of Brexit. Maybe first give us a sense of your recollections of that night, so the 23rd of June, 10 years ago.
Well, good evening, Mared. Of course, I think everybody remembers where they were when Brexit happened, because it was a truly historic moment. And I was in London in the Guildhall at an Observer event with politicians and analysts. And I can still remember the shell-shocked look on their faces as it emerged, as night turned into day, that the UK was leaving the European Union. By about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, it really was a real deal. And everybody thought, well, what next? Because remember, when this referendum was held, it was its yes or no answer. There was no indication of the implications or what Brexit would look like. And we know that the UK took years to get to that piece. But I will say, Mared, I wasn't that shocked, despite the fact that the polls were showing that Remain would win, because I did spend a lot of time in very heavily impoverished areas across, in particular, England, parts of Dover, Bolton, Birmingham, and people who were telling me they were going to leave, they felt that they could have better opportunities outside the EU, but also they wanted to really give a protest to the establishment because of the situation that they found themselves in. So it wasn't that much of a shock to me, but I do remember this day, 10 years ago, the 24th, was the day when people were just looking at each other saying, what next? What does this actually mean?
And Shona, you're in Dublin first. The Irish question, of course, a major stumbling block in those negotiations. What is the sense you get when you're there now today on the impact Brexit has had politically and economically on both sides of the Irish border?
Yeah, it turned out to be quite the epicentre, because not just that the UK didn't know what it meant to leave the EU per se from an economic perspective, but there was a real threat to the island of Ireland, to the economy of Ireland, but more specifically to the Good Friday Agreement, which basically was a resolution to end 30 years of conflict on the island. The reason why that was able to materialise is because the UK and Ireland were both in the European Union. When the single market was created, it meant that the border came down between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And there was a fear that if that border was reinstated for the UK leaving the EU, that then you could have a lot of violence again. Because remember, removing the border meant that people, Irish people who were Northern Irish, who felt themselves as Irish or Northern Irish, that they could be part of the Republic as well. So it allowed for self-determination of those people. So there was real concern that the rollback of the Good Friday Agreement would happen. But I caught up with Leo Varadkar, who was the Irish Taoiseach, the Prime Minister at the time, who was really the key negotiator for the longest period of Brexit. And I asked him, first of all, for his assessment and recollection of Brexit.
Look, I think my main reflection is one of regret. I still think it was the wrong decision, and I really miss the fact that the United Kingdom is no longer at the table, is no longer part of the EU. I think it was part of a broader trend internationally of increased populism and increased nationalism. We maybe didn't see that at the time. I think that's more obvious now. And I still hope one day the UK will find their way back to the table.
What was at risk for Ireland during that time?
Very substantial. The biggest risk, I think, was that we could have ended up with a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and that could have threatened the peace settlement, the Good Friday Agreement. There also could have been very serious economic damage to Ireland, given our strong trading relationship with the UK, and also the possibility, under certain circumstances, that Ireland itself might have been pulled out of the single market, or might have had to reassess our membership of the European Union. And I was determined that none of those three things would happen.
When you mentioned there that there was a threat to the Good Friday Agreement, the peace settlement on the island, do you think that there was ever potential for a return to violence?
Well, that was not only my view, that was the intelligence briefing and security advice given both by the head of police here in Ireland and also the chief constable in Northern Ireland. It was their security assessment that if a hard border was re-established on the land border between North and South, that could lead to return to violence. There was never any certainty of that, but that was the warning that they were giving us. And I think it was appropriate that we shared that with the wider European family.
Do you think, 10 years on, that the UK could ever rejoin the EU?
No, I genuinely believe it is possible. It seems, when asked in opinion polls anyway, that the majority of British people regret the decision, and particularly younger people are very keen to rejoin. Unfortunately, the political leadership doesn't exist in Westminster for that to be done. But it's not impossible that it mightn't happen in future. I remember people thinking Brexit was a ridiculous, impossible idea 15, 20 years ago. And equally, I don't think it's impossible that the UK may rejoin, perhaps in 10 or 15 years' time. But the European Union is changing. And I think having the UK back at the table would be so valuable that the European Union should be willing to change to allow countries like the UK to join or join in some way. So I don't think they should be required, for example, to have to join the euro if they don't want to.
And just one other question I wanted to ask you about Brexit, because a lot of people would love to know what the conversation was like when you were in the Wirral with Boris Johnson. That was a significant turning point in the negotiations for Brexit, which actually allowed the final agreement to pass and materialise.
Well, look, I think crucially it was a one-to-one discussion, and often they're the most productive ones in politics when the officials and advisors and diplomats are not in the room. So we were able to have a conversation, a discussion with plausible deniability on both sides. I do think crucially we were all coming up against deadlines.
In the end, did he renege on that agreement, though?
Well, yes, quite frankly, he certainly tried to, and we had to make amendments to it, and we're eventually in a position to make a new agreement with Prime Minister Sunak, which wasn't all that different from the previous one.
That was the former Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar speaking to our correspondent Shona there. Now, UK politics has moved at a dizzying speed over the past days, as we've mentioned. Just a week ago, I sat down in London with the UK Minister for EU Relations, Nick Thomas-Symonds, to talk about the government's progress in reaching new deals with the EU ahead of a planned EU-UK summit on July the 22nd.
I am very confident of closing this deal. Of course we will get moments, as you always do, moments of difficulty in the final parts of negotiation, but I'm very confident of closing this deal and delivering a very successful 2026 summit.
But just days later, Andy Burnham, the former Manchester mayor, won a seat in Parliament and took a step closer to challenging the leadership of Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The political pressure on Starmer then became too hard to ignore.
The question my party is asking now is whether I am best placed to lead us into the next general election. I have heard the answer of my parliamentary party to that question, and I accept that answer with good grace. That is why I will resign as leader of the Labour Party.
Unbelievably, we're about to have our 6th Prime Minister in 7 years. I remember growing up thinking Italy was totally ungovernable as they went through a new Prime Minister every year, and yet that's where we are here. Let's have a general election. Let's get a government with a clear democratic mandate.
The UK is now poised to get its 7th Prime Minister in 10 years. Crucially, Andy Burnham looks like he might run uncontested for the role, meaning he could be in post as early as the 18th of July. The EU-UK summit, which was meant to take place here in Brussels days later, has been postponed, meaning efforts to remove barriers to trade and cooperation are again in limbo. All the while, the party of arch-Brexiteer Nigel Farage continues to top the polls in the UK. Now, Claire Fox is a House of Lords peer and briefly served as a member of the European Parliament for Farage's previous party, the Brexit Party. I spoke to her earlier and started by asking her whether 10 years on, she still defended Brexit as a positive outcome for the UK.
Absolutely a positive decision. A positive decision because it really created an atmosphere of democratic enthusiasm. People felt that they were able to participate in this very important constitutional decision, did lots of thinking about it and research in the build-up to it, made a decision that actually, from a democratic and sovereign point of view, we would be better off out of the EU. And despite huge establishment top-down pressure telling us that it would be an absolute catastrophic disaster if we left the EU, people just said, well, we've thought about it and we're prepared to take that risk, and they did.
But apart from that democratic exercise, in terms of the concrete impact, because we are talking perhaps of a hit of as much as 8% to GDP per head, you know, the economic indicators have not been going upwards, let's say, since that moment. Can you continue to defend this decision and its impact on British taxpayers, British workers, British people 10 years on?
Well, the first thing to say is that 8% is a contested figure, but I'm not going to even dwell on that, right? It is true that the British economy is not healthy. Neither is the German economy. To be honest with you, if you go around the EU and look at the member states, Britain is no worse and in some instances much better than anywhere else. There's a crisis in the West, which we need to all tackle. When I look at the EU at the moment, even your own Eurocrats like Draghi are saying, oh my God, we've over-regulated, we can't do anything, we're going to become a technological barren force. I mean, I think that's not inspiring.
So when you say about the crisis in the West, that this economic crisis is common perhaps to all Western European nations, what about the crisis in government? Is it specifically a British problem now? And could you say that Brexit has actually made the UK ungovernable?
Not ungovernable, but it's no longer the case that politicians who are elected by the British people can get away with being inadequate and not up to the task. And when they aren't, the British people make it clear, because they've learnt the lessons of democracy, that they will act accordingly. And I think that you will see that this is not, Britain is not alone. When you talk about ungovernable, what you're talking about are the people who are really should be in charge. That is the voters. Politicians are answerable to the voters. They are the servants, the public servants of the voters. And I'm afraid the way that in the EU, the voters of EU countries are treated as though they're somehow beyond the pale. I consider myself to be a European. I wanted to leave the EU, not Europe. I hope that there will be solidarity and activity in relation to different member states and the UK. But being involved in the EU, where they actually impose all those rules and regulations and tell you what you should and shouldn't do, which therefore is removing a whole swathe of laws from the scrutiny of the British public. That's not on. And if Andy Burnham goes down that road, I can assure you he won't be Prime Minister for very long.
Now let's bring in our MEPs Martin Shirdevan and Cynthia Niebuku. Cynthia, I'm going to go straight to you. The suggestion that maybe, the economic political woes are not just in the UK. It's common to all of Europe. Does she have a point? Because competitiveness, international trade, geopolitics, it's affecting all the EU member states.
No, I don't think she has a point, the former MEP, and I don't agree with any of her politics. And I don't have any regard whatsoever for Nigel Farage's party and the misinformation and disinformation that is spread by the far right. I think they did an awful lot of damage, obviously, in the Brexit vote. I think they thrive on damage and disinformation and misinformation. And I think the likes of making that statement, which is, we don't want the EU imposing rules on us, again, it's the rhetoric of the far right. Can I say, the European Parliament, where I'm a co-legislator dealing with the Commission and the Council, it is a completely democratic institution where everybody is able to have its voice, and the Council are involved, which are the ministers from the various countries. So this idea that somehow it's imposed, I think that's a perception. I don't think it's a reality. And in my home country in Ireland, for example, people are very supportive of the membership of the European Union and what they give to it and what they get from it. And I think the former MEP is incorrect to say that there are other financial woes and market woes around Europe, that somehow can excuse what has happened in Britain. If you look at Britain, look at the fact that they tried to set up an equivalence of the Erasmus Plus programme. It didn't work.
And now
they're back in at a very heavy price, a very high price. They thought they were going to be able to go fortress and close their borders. And now their migration issue is as bad as ever. And of course, we saw the fiasco of Rwanda in the meantime and the returns policy to there.
Although some EU nations are exploring similar options.
Yes, but let's stick with the UK. So I don't accept the arguments. The only sentiment I agree with the former MEP on is that, yes, us elected politicians, I firmly believe we are at the service of the people, and we do need to tell the people how beneficial and how democratic the European Union is.
I want to bring in you, Martin, because there are increasing calls, though, including from EU leaders themselves, for the EU to reform itself. This is coming from leaders like Macron. Does it mean that, in the future there might be an opportunity to work closer with the UK on some kind of two-speed Europe? Isn't that the direction we're going in? Especially consider the fact that many traditionally Eurosceptic parties are topping the polls, and there are big elections coming next year.
Yeah, but I think that we need to align our policies, the UK and the European Union, given the political landscape, international political landscape and the challenges that we face there. There's a threat economically coming from China. There's a threat politically and economically coming from the US. So there is something that we need to do. And I think that United Kingdom is a very important partner for the European politics. And this is something that we need to develop. I don't want to interfere in British politics and in Labour politics. But if there is a new Prime Minister, I hope that he will take the steps towards the European Union in order to align some of the policies.
But do you say then that maybe Keir Starmer has been a little bit too complacent when it comes to Donald Trump and the US and maintaining the special relationship, but then his successor needs to be more firm in getting closer to the EU?
Well, when it comes to trade, when it comes to security, then of course the EU depends on the US, and this is something that we, I think, really need to reconsider and possibly need to change. And it would have been good if also Keir Starmer would have taken a clearer position on Trump, as many other European leaders did.
I want to come back to you, Cynthia, because there are models, the Norwegian model, the Swiss model, where the UK could become part of the single market. It could still remain outside the bloc formally. Is that the right direction of travel you're seeing right now, that there could be a deal on the single market and eventually that the Labour Party will drop its red lines on that?
I personally, this is my perspective, and far be it from me to interfere with British politics either, but I personally would like Europe to hold tough with regards to any rejoining by Great Britain into the European Union, with all the benefits that it can yield from that. And I don't think there should be any special deals done, because I think that will open and set a precedent. It will open a floodgate perhaps and set a precedent, and other countries could say, why not me? I leave and I'll get back in on a special concession. So I do think that the British people, I think, have to think carefully now, led by their politicians, advised by their politicians. But it's even more difficult now, Mared, I believe, and Martin, in the news media world that we live in now. I fear that democracy is even more so under threat than it was 10 years ago because of the advancements of AI on top of social media and everything. So the misinformation we saw 10 years ago has been multiplied now. So Andy Burnham, if he is to be the next Prime Minister, and we all believe he is, he's going to have to be extremely clear with his voter base.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to both of you. We are now, in fact, crossing over again to Dublin, where our Shona Murray is still standing by for us. Shona, we've been talking a bit about the future of EU-UK ties. Obviously, that summit that was due to take place in a month is now effectively postponed. How much of a knock do you think this is to the UK and the Labour Party's efforts to tighten those ties with the EU?
Yeah, well, Mared, I mean, with Keir Starmer resigning, it is the 7th Prime Minister since Brexit, all at the altar of Brexit. So I think the EU can say we've been here before. So there's not going to be too much drama in relation to this decision to postpone the 22nd of July date for the meeting. But what I can say is that what was supposed to materialise in that meeting was a very crucial agreement between the EU and the UK, where the UK would align with all the EU's regulations on animal goods, on foods and other areas of export, so that the UK could frictionlessly export back into the EU market. Now, it's something that Brexiteers hate because part of Brexit was the so-called regulatory sovereignty, but at the same time it makes sense for the UK because it means that they can export into its closest market, particularly in the agriculture and the food sector. So it's very meaningful. And I think the key point in that is that the negotiations for this were pretty much complete. So all it really takes is Andy Burnham, if he's to be the next Prime Minister of the UK, to sort of pick up where Keir Starmer left off. So I don't think there's going to be any real bumps in the road in that way.
Interesting. So Burnham taking up the baton from Keir Starmer on that. Briefly, Shona, EU officials here in Brussels, do you think they're really thinking seriously about the prospect of the UK rejoining and how that would work in practice?
Well, I don't think that the Commission has a task force ready for the day the UK decides to rejoin the EU. But as we heard from Michel Barnier, Leo Varadkar, various others, the door is open. So that means if the UK does decide it wants closer ties, if it's in the EU's interest, that will be the case. And that also includes rejoining the single market, the customs union and the European Union. But very much key to this, because we've seen 10 years, the best part of 10 years of negotiations between the EU and the UK over Brexit, and the UK not knowing what Brexit looks like. The EU will have to be really assured that if the UK changes its mind, has another referendum, that means that they're staying in the EU, because there's a huge fear that Andy Burnham, Keir Starmer can make all these decisions, but then if Nigel Farage becomes Prime Minister of the UK, he could unravel them all. And the last thing Brussels needs is more belligerence and confrontation with Britain. Mared?
OK, Shona, thank you so much for being with us this evening on the programme. But moving on now, Gina Miller is one of the most prominent British voices who fought against Theresa May and Boris Johnson's successive Conservative governments. In 2 landmark legal cases, she successfully challenged their bypassing of Parliament to push through Brexit. She's also a business owner and philanthropist. Our reporter Estelle Nielsen-Julien spoke to her in an interview and started by asking her where she felt Brexit had left the UK economically and politically.
It's been a decade of decline. Unfortunately, there was no plan, which is always something I suspected, that the Brexiteers, the Leavers, had no plan for what would happen if they had won. And that has unfortunately played out in the fact that there is a confirmation that our economy has been damaged by around 4 to 5. Actually, now most economists say it's about 5% GDP. We have a real lack of foreign investment into the UK, and the country has become more divided. I mean, Brexit, the whole referendum, the dishonesty and the way the division that was sown has damaged our country. So it is now a place that is very much a populist country. As I said, the instability in our politics, in our institutions, is everywhere. And I'm afraid it's a very febrile environment. And it saddens me to think that where we are 10 years on is actually somewhere that the politicians should have had more responsibility in ensuring we never got to. So my view now is about what happens for the next 10 years. So we have to look forwards. And I'm hoping for a leader, now that our Prime Minister has resigned, I'm hoping that a new leader of the Labour Party has a plan and a strategy and can give some clarity on the direction of travel, on our relationship with Europe, from the point of view of our economy, prosperity, defence, which is so important, and also tackling the big issues such as AI and the environment.
And before we look forward, just to finish looking backwards, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest lies about Brexit that never came true? And in contrast, have any promises?
The biggest lie was about Turkey joining. Those posters that Leave Remain, that we would have hundreds of thousands of people coming across our border they were fabricated lies, and they were images that were generated that were not true. The lies on that it would end immigration, all it's done, and we can see that, we've had the highest levels of legal migration post-Brexit than we have ever had, close to, depending on your figures, somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million people that are ex-EU. So the idea when I was going around the country that was being sold by Brexiteers is leave the EU, stop our migration problems. It was a lie. And then the 350 million that we would save for the NHS was a lie. There were so many of them.
And you decided to take the government to court over its handling of Brexit, which made you kind of public enemy number one for Brexiteers. But from your perspective, would you say there's a culture of political apathy in the UK compared to European neighbours? The
one positive, if there is one positive from Brexit, is that as a country, ordinary people in the street didn't really talk about politics as they do in Europe, as you do in your European member states. Now people are much more engaged. That said, it is also very divisive politics. So, there's good and bad to that. But I think the problem is that we don't have politicians with courage. We do not have politicians that are spelling out the difficulties of where we are, not just to do with Europe, because there are so many economic and domestic problems that we have in the UK. We can't do very much if we don't have money in the coffers. One of the things we need to do is to ensure that we can increase our GDP and investment from abroad. And the markets and investors, if there was a plan that they could see, not just people in the UK, that sense of stability and a direction of travel would actually increase the confidence that people have. And at the moment, very few people, be it businesses, investors, and the public themselves, have confidence in our politicians.
That was Gina Miller speaking to Euronews' Estelle Nielsen-Julian. And that brings tonight's special report to an end. Thank you so much to all of our guests. Thank you, Martin Schödevan. Thank you, Cynthia Nievoko. It's been great to have you. I'm sure we could speak all night and continue into the early hours. But if you've been left wanting more analysis on Brexit and its implications, stay tuned here on Euronews for our special debate show, The Ring, airing at 8:30 this evening. MEPs Sander Smith and Barry Andrews will be going head-to-head on Brexit. But in the meantime, thank you for tuning in tonight and have a great rest of the evening.
Von Bruder Maximilian. Das von Ihnen gegründete Start-up Planet A Foods revolutioniert die Süßwarenindustrie. Hier in einem unscheinbaren Industriegebiet im Süden Deutschlands entwickelt Sarah ein Patent nach dem anderen. Heute wird zusammen mit Chefkoch Lukas ein neues Rezept für die Schokoladenalternative Joviva ausprobiert.